In 1921, Virginia Rappe died in Hollywood. Studios and courts controlled the narrative. A file was stamped closed. What really happened to Rappe? Before her name entered court transcripts and newspaper columns, Virginia Rappe existed first as an image, a silhouette against studio lights, a face refined by grease paint and patience, a figure framed carefully for a city still inventing itself. Hollywood in the late 19-teens was not yet a monument. It was a workshop of illusion, powered by ambition, rumor, and untested machines that turned faces into currency. Virginia arrived with the posture of someone accustomed to being looked at. Born on the East Coast, shaped by the stage, she moved through New York fashion circles before cinema claimed her attention. She worked as a model. She designed dresses. She learned how fabric could command a room and how a still body could project a story. When the motion picture industry began recruiting women who understood how to carry spectacle without speaking a word, Virginia fit easily into its gaze. By the time she reached California, the silent era was ascending into full momentum. Cameras were hand-cranked. Sets were lit like theater stages. Directors sought faces that could carry emotion across a darkened auditorium. Virginia's features photographed elegantly. Her eyes held a quiet intensity that suggested depth, even when scripts gave her little to say. She was cast in supporting roles. She posed for publicity stills. She appeared in society pages beside other rising figures of the screen. The myth that formed around her was gentle and modern. A young woman of taste, a designer with artistic sensibility, a screen actress with refinement rather than vulgar spectacle. Studios encouraged such narratives. They needed stars who embodied aspiration for a generation emerging from war and influenza. Virginia's image was shaped accordingly: graceful, tasteful, controlled. She moved through hotel lobbies where producers gathered. She attended dinners where deals were sealed between courses. She was photographed at beaches and premieres, always carefully arranged, always slightly distant from the viewer, as though already living inside a projection booth's beam. Nothing in those images suggested danger. Nothing suggested the story would end abruptly. Hollywood at that moment was small enough that every career depended on proximity to power. Studio heads, directors, financiers, press agents who wrote tomorrow's headlines before events had even settled. To remain visible required constant motion, constant availability. A missed invitation could mean disappearing from casting lists. Virginia understood this rhythm. She accepted work where it came. She maintained friendships that connected her to opportunity. She adapted, as so many did, to a city that rewarded those who did not ask too many questions. Her name began appearing in trade papers with mild optimism. A promising player. A woman with design talents that might open further doors. A figure who belonged to the new Hollywood womanhood, independent, stylish, unafraid of modern life. The studios encouraged such archetypes. They sold fantasy not only on screen, but off it. In private letters and recollections, acquaintances described her as gentle, reserved, observant. Not a scandal maker, not a headline chaser. Someone who watched rooms before speaking. Someone who understood that silence could be more valuable than confession. This discretion served her well in a town built on performance. By 1921, Virginia was not a star, but she was on the path. A working actress, a recognized designer, a familiar face at gatherings where the industry's young elite tested the boundaries of their newfound freedom. She occupied that delicate space between anonymity and celebrity, where futures could still be written in either direction. To the public, she was a minor figure of promise. To the industry, she was a useful presence, beautiful, compliant, adaptable. To herself, perhaps, she was simply a woman trying to secure a place in a city that devoured uncertainty. The photographs from that period remain: a woman poised on staircases, a woman seated elegantly in a studio chair, a woman smiling faintly beside colleagues. The images convey calm. They convey intention. They convey a life still unfolding. But even in those pictures, if one studies them long enough, there is something else. A tension in the jaw, a stillness too careful, a sense that behind the polished surface, something is being held in reserve. A story not yet told. By the early 1920s, Hollywood had ceased to be merely a frontier of creativity. It had become a structured industry. Studios consolidated power, contracts bound performers to executives who controlled casting, publicity, and personal reputation. The dream factory had hardened into an assembly line, and every figure within it, director, starlet, writer, designer, was a component to be positioned, maintained, or discarded. Virginia Rappe worked inside this system without fully belonging to any single studio. She was not yet locked into an exclusive contract, which offered freedom but removed protection. Contract stars were guarded assets, their scandals managed, their illnesses concealed, their absences explained away. Independent players like Virginia moved more precariously. They were visible enough to be invited, but expendable enough to be unshielded. Publicists orchestrated every narrative. A lunch photographed, a fitting described to the press, a rumored engagement floated to generate interest. Hollywood gossip columns had become semi-official channels of studio messaging, and power brokers understood how to plant stories that shaped careers. Reputation was a currency traded by men who rarely appeared in photographs themselves. Among these men were producers who controlled access to roles, lawyers who mediated disputes before they reached court, and fixers who specialized in quiet solutions. A whisper could end a career. A signature could resurrect it. For women especially, survival often depended on choosing which invitations to accept and which to decline, in rooms where refusal could be interpreted as ingratitude. Virginia navigated this environment with the caution of someone aware that every relationship carried consequence. She designed gowns for actresses whose contracts ensured constant visibility. She socialized with stars whose names commanded box office receipts. She attended gatherings hosted by men whose authority was never written on paper but understood by everyone present. The system rewarded proximity to celebrity. One such center of gravity was Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, one of the highest paid and most beloved comedians of the silent era. His studio contract made him nearly untouchable. He was a financial pillar in an industry still proving itself to Wall Street investors. His successes funded other productions. His failures would have threatened many livelihoods. Protecting him was not merely loyalty, it was economic necessity. When Arbuckle invited guests to private parties, attendance signaled belonging to Hollywood's inner circle. These were gatherings where deals were suggested over champagne, where introductions could change fortunes. Declining such invitations risked being forgotten. Accepting them meant stepping inside spaces where behavior blurred between leisure and transaction. Virginia accepted such invitations. It was what working actresses did. No contracts guaranteed her tomorrow's income. No studio press office curated her image. She remained dependent on personal networks and reputation. A woman alone in a system designed, owned, and enforced by men. Behind every smiling publicity still was an infrastructure of power. Studio executives monitoring press sentiment, lawyers prepared to intervene, columnists waiting for direction, police departments accustomed to receiving discreet calls from influential producers. Hollywood was not just a town. It was a jurisdiction with its own gravity, capable of bending ordinary procedures. Within this machinery, Virginia's autonomy grew narrower. Invitations carried obligation. Friendships carried expectation. Appearances were noticed and recorded. Every decision existed inside a web she did not control. And yet, from the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Trade papers continued to mention her fashion designs. Photographs showed her poised and fashionable. The illusion held. But beneath the carefully manufactured world, a silent imbalance persisted. One woman without institutional protection. One industry structured to defend its investments. One network where power flowed in only one direction. Soon, Virginia would enter a room where that imbalance would matter. And from that moment forward, her choices would no longer belong entirely to her. By the summer of 1921, the rhythm of Hollywood had become relentless. Productions accelerated, press deadlines tightened, new theaters opened across America, demanding fresh pictures and fresh faces. The city no longer slept between projects. It pulsed, and those within it learned quickly that stillness was dangerous. Virginia Rappe felt the strain of this pace in ways the camera could not capture. Her work as a designer brought irregular income. Acting roles came sporadically, never enough to secure stability. She moved from boarding houses to hotel rooms, carrying trunks of dresses and sketches, always prepared to present herself as composed, ready, available. Friends noted her increasing fatigue, stomach pains, periods of weakness. She visited doctors quietly, careful not to let word spread. In an industry where illness could disqualify a performer overnight, privacy was survival. Yet medical care, in that era, offered little clarity. Diagnoses were uncertain. Treatments were improvised. A woman's pain was often dismissed as nervousness. Publicly, she remained elegant. Privately, she endured discomfort without complaint. She understood that vulnerability had no currency in Hollywood. Only endurance did. Social gatherings became both opportunity and obligation. The city's power network functioned in private suites, behind velvet curtains and locked doors. Deals were whispered between drinks. Alliances were sealed through presence. For women without studio contracts, attendance was a necessary ritual. Virginia attended such gatherings even when unwell. She dressed carefully. She smiled. She participated. To refuse invitations from influential men was to risk exclusion from future work. To accept them was to place oneself inside rooms where boundaries were undefined. On Labor Day weekend, 1921, she entered one of those rooms. The Street. Francis Hotel in San Francisco was hosting a celebration. Roscoe Arbuckle had rented a suite. It was meant to be a retreat from Hollywood's pressure. A private holiday among friends and associates. Liquor flowed despite prohibition. Laughter carried down corridors. Doors opened and closed without formality. Virginia arrived among the guests. She had been invited. She accepted. No one would later dispute that her presence there was ordinary by Hollywood standards. Parties like this were routine. Attendance was expected. What happened inside was assumed to remain inside. Accounts of that day would later fracture into contradictions. Voices overlapping, timelines bending, testimonies adjusted. But one truth remained constant. At some point during the gathering, Virginia's health collapsed. She complained of pain. She retreated to a room. Hours passed. Confusion followed. By the time medical help was summoned, her condition had worsened. Doctors were called. Police became involved. The suite that had held music and laughter now held questions. Within hours, Hollywood's machinery engaged. Lawyers arrived. Studio representatives made calls. Press agents prepared statements. Before Virginia's fate was even fully understood, the system was already positioning itself. She was transported to a hospital. Her condition deteriorated. 3 days later, Virginia Rappe died. The newspapers ignited. Headlines spread across the nation. The death of a young actress at a star's private party became public spectacle. Moral crusaders demanded justice. Studio executives feared financial collapse. Arbuckle's fame transformed overnight from national treasure to national threat. And Virginia, the woman whose body had carried the burden of illness and exhaustion, whose career had never reached stardom, whose name had once appeared only in fashion notes and casting lists, was now central to a narrative far larger than herself. In the weeks that followed, she would be spoken for, interpreted, reframed, used as symbol. Her own voice already weakened by illness now erased by death, could no longer testify. The mirror had cracked, and the point of no return had arrived. Death in Hollywood was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a crisis of optics, capital, and control. When Virginia Rappe died on the 9th of September, 1921, the machinery that had once manufactured glamour now turned to containment. Doctors signed the certificate. Police filed reports. Newspapers ran with a story too potent to restrain. A beloved comedian, a private party, a young woman dead. In an America gripped by prohibition and moral anxiety, the narrative formed instantly. Sin in the palace of illusion, decadence punished. The film industry on trial, Roscoe Arbuckle was arrested. The highest-paid actor in the world was escorted through crowds, his face now framed not by studio lights but by flashbulbs of accusation. The district attorney announced prosecution. The press promised exposure. Reform groups demanded accountability. Hollywood felt the ground shift beneath it. Inside studio offices, panic was methodical. Contracts were reviewed, insurance clauses examined, release schedules reconsidered. Arbuckle's films were pulled from distribution. Theater owners canceled bookings. Investors called executives. The industry's carefully constructed image of innocence was cracking before the nation. Virginia's name became a headline fixture, but the woman herself remained absent. She had no statement. No diary entered the record. No filmed interview. Her story existed only through others: doctors, witnesses, police officers, attorneys. Each account filtered through fear, loyalty, self-preservation. 3 trials followed. In courtrooms packed with reporters, testimony unfolded in fragments. Guests recalled moments selectively. Medical experts debated causes. Lawyers constructed narratives of assault, then of accident, then of hysteria. Each version served a purpose. Each left something unsaid. Virginia's body became evidence. Her pain became argument. Her final hours became currency in a battle that was never truly about her. It was about whether Hollywood could survive public outrage, whether a star could be sacrificed to protect an industry, whether truth mattered more than damage control. The first 2 juries deadlocked. The third acquitted Arbuckle. A formal apology from the jury was issued, yet the acquittal came too late to restore what had already collapsed. His career was destroyed. Studios severed ties. Exhibitors refused his films. The system had protected itself by offering a scapegoat, then discarding him once the threat passed. Virginia's name receded just as quickly as it had risen. After the verdict, newspapers moved on. New scandals emerged. New stars filled marquees. Her funeral had been small, her grave unremarked by the industry that once photographed her gowns. Hollywood exhaled. It rewrote its public posture. Studios imposed morality clauses. Publicity departments tightened control. Parties became quieter. Contracts became stricter. The machine learned from the crisis. It adapted. But no film was ever made about Virginia. No official studio tribute. No sanctioned biography. Her narrative remained too dangerous, too entwined with institutional negligence, unchecked privilege, and the fragile illusion of virtue the industry sold to America. And in the silence that followed, a question lingered behind locked filing cabinets and sealed court documents. Not shouted, not pursued, just quietly buried. Silence after the fall. In the months after the trials, Hollywood moved forward with deliberate amnesia. The industry could not afford prolonged reflection. New productions were announced. New romances staged for photographers. New scandals carefully redirected. The machinery resumed, louder than before, as if motion alone could erase memory. Virginia Rappe did not receive such luxury. No studio retained her likeness in anniversary retrospectives. No memoir by producers recalled her work as a designer. No commemorative column honored her as a lost talent. She was neither star enough to be celebrated, nor anonymous enough to be forgotten quietly. She occupied an uncomfortable space in the historical record, central to a catastrophe inconvenient to preserve. Court transcripts were filed and archived, police statements stored, medical reports locked in cabinets. Newspapers kept their clippings, yellowing with time. Each document held a piece of the event, but none held the whole. Testimonies contradicted. Timelines overlapped imperfectly. Motives were assumed, not proven. The official conclusion rested on acquittal, not understanding. In later years, historians would note inconsistencies. A witness who changed accounts, a doctor whose statements evolved, a prosecutor with political ambitions, a defense team under studio-funded pressure. These were not conspiracies. They were ordinary forces of institutional survival, operating in an era before transparency became expectation. Virginia's own words never appeared. No recorded interview, no written testimony beyond brief medical complaints. Her perspective remained the only one absent from the record, a missing voice in a case defined by competing narratives. The industry ensured the episode became a cautionary tale about excess rather than a reflection on vulnerability. The lesson was not protection of the powerless, but discipline of the powerful. Stars were instructed to behave. Studios strengthened control. Morality clauses entered contracts. The machine fortified itself against repetition, and Virginia's name faded into footnotes. Occasionally invoked in film history lectures, mentioned in biographies of Arbuckle, recalled in academic studies of media scandal. Always present, never centered. Her story exists now only in fragments. Photographs of her designs, casting announcements, society columns, courtroom sketches, hospital records, pieces of a life reconstructed by those who never met her, an identity assembled from external observation. The truth was never entirely hidden. It was simply dispersed across institutions with no incentive to consolidate it. The file was not locked by a single hand. It was closed by collective convenience. What remains are contradictions. A woman described as ill before the party, yet expected to socialize. A star described as benevolent, yet capable of recklessness. A justice system that both prosecuted and apologized. An industry that claimed innocence, while rewriting its own rules in response. No final testimony, no definitive explanation, only documentation without resolution. Virginia Rappe entered Hollywood seeking opportunity. She left it as an unanswered question, and in the quiet archives where her records rest, the story remains incomplete. Where legends fall into shadow,